and welcome to this special bonus episode of Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye, and with me, as usual, is my good friend, Dr. Warren Dockter, but also our special guest, who is Timothy Riley, Director and Chief Curator of America's National Churchill Museum at Westminster College. Tim, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's start off with a big question, which is about Churchill in the United States. As we said, the museum is the Churchill National Museum for the United States of America. And in fact, in the UK, although there are several historic sites associated with Churchill, we don't have a national museum. Maybe a bit unusual to have such an important museum dedicated to another country's prime minister. So why would you say, what is it that makes Churchill such a big deal in the USA?
Well, thank you. This place here, America's National Churchill Museum, I like to describe to especially first-time visitors who say, what is it and how did you get there? It's a little bit like a United States presidential library for a British prime minister, which is highly unusual. There's nothing else quite like it. And I think it speaks volumes to the admiration that Churchill has historically enjoyed in the United States. Of course, his mother was from Brooklyn, so he's half American. And during his lifetime, he, from an early age, recognized his affinity for the United States. And it was more than just an affinity or a family relation, though. I think many of the values that the two countries share, rule of law, common heritage, common language, of course, was something that fascinated Churchill early on and something that extends beyond, of course, the more famous alliance and the partnership in the war years. But I think Churchill had a deep affinity for the values of the rule of law and Constitution of the United States, something he talked about throughout his lifetime. So Churchill's admiration for the United States is paid back by the United States' admiration for Churchill.
Well, that's interesting. What do you think about what particularly appealed to Churchill about the United States? He obviously visited many times. What was it about the country when he actually visited which really hooked him in?
Well, I think the vastness of the country. I mean, Churchill visited from coast to coast at different periods throughout his lifetime in his various journeys to North America and the United States in particular. But I think Churchill was attracted to kind of the boldness, the American ideal, the maverickness of the United States, the ambition of the United States. Those were qualities that he possessed in spades, and I think he related to. So I think on a personal level, Churchill's admiration, extended to those qualities of the United States and its reputation. But he also understood the United States as an economic engine, and the support that the United States economy provided during the war and after and before was something that Churchill was also wanted to be close to. So it was not just an ideal or political thing. There was certainly at times economic things. Right before he came to Fulton in the Iron Curtain speech, he was not in high office. He was out of office, a backbencher after winning the war, losing the election in 1945. But he had an important role before he gave the Iron Curtain speech here at Fulton at Westminster College to kind of negotiate a loan to make sure that the post-war economy in Britain would be helped by the United States. So there was that aspect too.
I'm going to flip this question on its head a little bit, Tim. It's clear to me what Churchill found very interesting to him, and also because he was half American, you say about America. But just to kind of flip it again, to what is America's fascination with Churchill? I mean, what does he come to represent in the kind of American pantheon? Because we don't have, much to my chagrin, a similar relationship with Gladstone or Disraeli here. There's no Disraeli museum in Missouri or in Knoxville, Tennessee, although I'd be interested in starting a Gladstone museum if anyone's listening. But I just wonder what it is that he's come to represent for America.
I think that answer is going to be different for every person, individual. What I find fascinating is that Churchill, in general, finds sympathy. This is certainly the case of visitors to the America's National Churchill Museum who come from all walks of life. It's highly successful people, school children, teachers, both political parties find fascination in Churchill, and I think they find his capacity to lead, his ability to have a turn of phrase. Sometimes we're attracted to Churchill because of were first exposed to him as from a clever quote or a quip or his wit. But I think as people learn about Churchill, he was also a very deeply human person. I mean, he loved painting. He was he cried in public oftentimes and wept and thought deeply and felt deeply emotionally about certain issues. People, as at least visitors to the museum, when they think about Churchill the man, they see someone they can relate to. It's not just the image of this aristocratic, cigar-smoking, champagne-sipping Englishman, but it's someone who stood for something better. There are a lot of avenues to Winston Churchill. I think that are attractive to Americans in particular, and of course, his boldness. I think what I said earlier about Churchill admiring America for his brashness, I think some of the Americans find him equally so, and I think there's an appealing aspect to him too.
As an American, I think so too. That kind of pugnaciousness. Oh yeah, I'll show you. We recently did a talk about Churchill's speech in Canada where he talked about some chicken, some neck.
Right.
Something that Americans find really attractive. I certainly find it very attractive in a leader. I didn't mean to cut you off, Richard. I get excited when we talk about this stuff.
I was just going to come back and ask Tim about sort of your own personal Churchill journey, if you will. What was your career before being a director of the museum? When did you first get interested in Churchill? I think it probably is more than just being interested. If you're going to end up directing a museum, it's got to be more of a kind of an obsession, right?
Well, it's become one, that's for sure. It dated really about 10, 15 years ago. I'm an art historian by training, so my specialty is the history of art. And I was directing an art museum in Wisconsin. And one of the chief benefactors of the museum, who was a big Churchill collector and fan, I had just heard, and this will give you a sense of the timing, that the new American president, newly elected President Obama, when he took office, was doing some redecorating in the Oval Office, as every president does. And it was announced that the Obama administration was sending back the bust of Winston Churchill by Jacob Epstein, which had been placed on loan to George H.W. Bush right after 9/11. And the Obama administration was sending that bust of Churchill back to the embassy. And it caused, as some listeners may recall, kerfuffle in the press because there were some astonished that the American president would eschew Winston Churchill in the Oval. And the new administration was saying, well, no, we didn't do it, but we didn't send it back. It's right here. And it was a communications kerfuffle. And it turns out all parties were right. There were two busts. One was upstairs in the private residence, and one was indeed sent back. But at the time, I was asked by this benefactor of the museum I was decorating, well, if the president doesn't want it, perhaps I can acquire it from my collection. Would you be so kind and see if we can acquire it? And I knew the answer was no, but I did my due diligence and I called the embassy and they were polite to say it's not for sale. And then the benefactor said, well, why don't we do a Churchill exhibition? And I thought, well, let's do it. And so we did. And I cold called Edwina Sams, who was Winston Churchill's granddaughter, and I called a place I had never heard of, frankly, before, which was the National Churchill Museum in Fulton, Missouri at Westminster College, and said, help, I'd like to do an exhibition on Winston Churchill. And we did, and it was a highly successful exhibition, including many of Churchill's paintings, documents, photographs, letters. And I realized that the public fascination with this statesman was very keen and intense. And I stuck with it. And when Churchill Museum here in Fulton called and we're looking for some assistance to put together a major international exhibition of Churchill's paintings in St. Louis a number of years ago, they called and said, we'd like you to help us out. And I've been here ever since. When the Churchill Museum here in Fulton called and we're looking for some assistance to put together a major international exhibition of Churchill's paintings in St. Louis a number of years ago, they called and said, we'd like you to help us out. And I've been here ever since.
Well, so that raises interesting questions because I wonder how in the American zeitgeist, Churchill's obviously seems a deeply political figure and perhaps even savior of Western civilization, depending on how much Hillsdale College stuff you read. But I wonder if one of the things that people forget about is the fact that he was a painter. And you said he was a deeply human person. And I just wonder if you could talk about Churchill as a painter a little bit.
Sure. Well, as an art historian, I was amazed and astonished to learn that Winston Churchill, known about and learned about in school and college, was in fact a painter. That was something that's not a headline when you first approach Winston Churchill. And I discovered that in 1915 during World War One, famously Churchill was forced to resign as First Lord of the Admiralty, which you've discussed, I think, on your podcasts, after the Dardanelles, and suffered from a black dog, his situational depression, and found solace in oil painting. And he picked up a brush, and he writes about it famously in 1921-22 in an essay, Painting as a Pastime, how painting came to his rescue. It was a level set for Winston. It was art therapy. Before we talked of art therapy, Churchill found it in oil painting. And he never turned back. At age 40, he picked up a brush for the first time and found refuge in painting. And we know he completed nearly 600 canvases in his lifetime as an amateur, self-taught, and thought of it as a refuge. And it gave him a chance to slow down. There's nothing like sitting in front of a blank canvas with some colors, looking at the world around you and saying, how am I going to make sense of this? And it forced him to slow down. It was the same mind, same brain that crafted these wonderful turns of phrase. Churchill painted with words, we know that famously, but he also painted with colors and shapes. He also painted, I would say, as a statesman, geopolitically. A little alliance here, a little nudge there is like putting a little blue in the corner or a little shadow in this corner. He looked at the world the same way as a canvas.
Yeah. So I think that what I would ask, so from your perspective as an art historian, is, just imagine that you didn't know who Winston Churchill was from the world historical perspective, and that you kind of see, well, there's this, come across some sort of mid-20th century paintings from this guy called Winston Churchill. What do you think you would sort of make of them in terms of style, influence, what you think the artist was trying to achieve?
Well, I think we can get bogged down in style, and he was a post-impressionist. He was an impressionist. I think Churchill was a painter. Period. He delighted in bright colors. He said it himself. He said, "I rejoice in the bright colors, and I feel genuinely sorry for the poor browns." And he was influenced by bright colors and Cezanne and Monet and all those great impressionists and post-impressionists. But he was distinctly Churchill. He didn't try to copy. He did copy paintings, anyone's particular style. He was just fascinated with the process. And I think he'd be surprised that he was exhibited in major museums these days. The Wallace Collection in London is about to open in this spring, a major exhibition of Churchill paintings. And I think it's wonderful.
In full disclosure, I'm contributing to that.
Great, that's terrific. And we are lending a painting from Fulton that's going to be in the exhibition. And I think it's a great way, again, as I said earlier, for people who aren't familiar with Churchill at all, or who don't like military history or think to enter and to be a point of access to Churchill.
Well, that's a great place to take a break, and we'll be back momentarily to talk further with Tim Riley, director of the National Churchill Museum in the USA, and we'll be talking about the Iron Curtain speech of 1946.
Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me as ever is my compatriot, Professor Richard Toye, and joining us today, not just me, but joining us, is Timothy Riley, the art curator and director at the Churchill Museum in Fulton, Missouri. I'm sure I butchered that title, Timothy. I'm sorry. And we were just talking about Churchill as an artist, and I have two more questions. Churchill as an artist, and I have two more questions I want to explore with that. And because this is a bonus episode, I thought I would indulge my interest. The first is, you and I talked briefly that you are familiar with David Locke's work called No More Champagne, which is a really interesting forensic accounting of Churchill's finances. And in it, he talks about Churchill framing himself as a rather sort of painting as a pastime. It was a hobby, in part because he is actually quite a good painter. As he won awards, he used a pseudonym, which I think was John Winters. Is that right?
David Winter.
David Winter,
yes.
that's right. And they would win prizes and be exhibited at places, even under a pseudonym. And David puts forth this kind of idea that he's actually quite a good painter, but he doesn't want to pay any tax on his paintings. And so he would say it's just a hobby. And in fact, he found some documents where he wrote to a tax collector and said, it's just a hobby. You can't tax me. And I just wonder what you thought about that.
Well, I think, certainly Churchill was ever one to avoid a tax. And that goes true with everything, in large part because his financial situation was such that he often couldn't pay it. I don't think that Churchill's removal from, I'm just an amateur painter, I just do it as a hobby, I think that was genuine. I don't think it was a tax evasion at all. He didn't sell paintings during his lifetime, except for very few exceptions. There were a couple of exhibited early on in a gallery in Paris, and I think late in life, he donated a painting to a charity auction. But for the most part, he gave them away to friends and colleagues, and Harry Truman and President Roosevelt he would give these paintings to. He didn't do it for any kind of financial gain at all.
Well, and one more art-related question, and then we can jump back into the meat of our podcast. I don't want to bore you, Richard. I'm sorry. But like I say, I'm contributing to this Wallace collection, and I was looking at some of his works, and this is more of a stylistic question. I thought you describing as a post-impressionist was really accurate, really interesting. And the painting I'm discussing is his the view of Jerusalem, which I think he painted in the 1920s when he was at the Cairo conference. But some of his paintings, and this is what Barry Phipps writes about a lot, and I just wonder what you think about this. I see there's this sort of idea out there that Churchill hated modernism, and there, he talks about being against Picasso and some of these guys, but he draws tremendously from people like William Nicholson and Paul Maz and corresponds with them and paints with them. And I just wonder, do you see that? I was looking at one of his paintings, I think of a sunrise over a beachscape, and I thought, oh my God, this looks like a Rothko painting. There's a real interesting modernism in some of his work, and I just wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
There is, and I think some of those, the sunrise painting, it's the one I'm thinking of, is very almost abstract. And again, I don't think Churchill looked or painted to exhibit. I don't think he was looking to contribute to the canon of Western art, period.
Yeah.
He did it as art therapy, as I mentioned, and it's something he genuinely and truly enjoyed. So I think we can get hung up in the isms, if you will, of the 20th century. Churchill did not get hung up in those things. He was a painter, period, and I think that's something that he considered. So I have a hard time putting him into a certain category. He didn't have the art historical background. He wasn't versed or schooled in these things. He appreciated, I think, growing up as a boy visiting Blenheim Palace. I mean, good gosh. I mean, he was surrounded by amazing works of art, and they weren't modern works. So perhaps he was drawn to those. That was what was familiar to him. He owned a Monet. I mean, he was given, Emery gave him a birthday present one year, and he has got a Monet, which hangs in Chartwell to this day. So he had an appreciation for art, and it was some of the comments he may have made about Picasso and others, he made, I think, somewhat cheekily, but I was stating he admired the idea of art.
So coming from the art back to the politics, I mean, I guess the thing which he had in common with both was that he wanted to make an impression, that he wanted to arrest people's attention, which a fortiori he did in Fulton, Missouri on 5th of March, 1946. So I guess we've talked about this, sort of the background to why he was coming in sort of previous episodes of the podcast. But I guess, what did this speech mean to Fulton, Missouri?
Fulton, Missouri was and is a small town. I mean, today the population is 12,000. It's rural, middle of America, heartland through and through. And it's the most unlikeliest of places for a speech that had such a global impact. Westminster College was an all-men's college in 1946. It had 212 students. It's hard to imagine because many of the men were away at war, hadn't come back. And here comes the President of the United States, accompanied by the former British Prime Minister, to give a speech that was arguably the beginning of the Cold War era. The speech meant a lot to Fulton, though I think that the immediate reaction was, what just happened? What did he just say? And that was true beyond Fulton, of course, as well. And there was the reaction to the speech was mixed. Eleanor Roosevelt hated it and thought, how could you be such a warmonger? Winston, Stalin was our ally, and now you're calling him our adversary. What's going on? Others saw it as prescient. and it turned out to be, I think, more prescient. Churchill knew what he was doing. I mean, he gave a lot of thought to this speech, and he spent January and February of 1946 in South Florida preparing and thinking and talking to the president and others about what he was going to say here. And we know after the speech on the train ride home, Churchill turned to an aide and said, "I think that was one of the greatest speeches that I ever gave." And this from a man who gave quite a few speeches. He knew he nailed it, and I think Fulton has come, and the world has come to know that the speech here made a tremendous impact.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point that you make, because obviously he often did devote a lot of time to individual speeches, maybe several days, but maybe this one actually had more of a run in. He was obviously now leader of the opposition. He wasn't, if we're honest, taking his duties as leader of the opposition incredibly seriously, because he was sort of going off for months. I think it was an era where it was a lot more accepted that politicians might kind of retreat into the background for a longer period if they had periods of ill health, as Churchill often did. It was kind of accepted that they might go on a cruise for a month in order to recover. So I guess there was, in the case of this speech, but even more intense thought than he usually gave to his rhetoric.
No, I think so. And it started just days after VE Day, when he was still prime minister before the general election in 1945. He cabled President Truman and referenced the Iron Curtain for the first time publicly to Truman, privately rather. And he was thinking about this. He saw after the war, the British went home, the Americans went home, and the Soviets stayed put. An Iron Curtain had descended across the continent, and Churchill was worried the Soviets might continue to expand. So this was something that was brewing in his mind from the end of the war. In fact, probably if you go way back, even before the war, the Soviet Union was a convenient ally and a necessary one. But I think, given his choice, Churchill probably would not have allied with the communists to begin with. So it is a long-standing concern of Winston Churchill's about the threat of Soviet communism. And it came to a head in March 5th, 1946. And so the thoughts and ideas that underpin the speech go back a lifetime for Churchill, but it came acute in the speech at Fulton.
Well, let's just then turn finally to the history of Westminster College and the founding of museum after the speech. I mean, a sort of extraordinary fact, which was that an entire London church, Christopher Wren's St. Mary the Virgin, was transported and rebuilt in Fulton, Missouri. How did that come about?
Well, you can appreciate this as both of you who work in the world of academia. By the 1960s, the Iron Curtain speech had become famous. I mean, it was clearly a seminal moment for Churchill and the world. And the leaders of Westminster College said, well, we really ought to do something to mark the speech, roughly 15, 20 years after the fact. And a committee was formed. Let's put up a statue. Let's put up a plaque. Let's do this. Let's do that. And the president of the college, Larry Davidson, Dr. Davidson at the time, had a bold idea and said, why don't we do something unusual? Why don't we bring over from central London a church from Christopher Wren that was bombed in the Blitz, left in ruins, and rebuild it on the campus of Westminster College in tribute of Winston Churchill?
Amazing stuff.
Pause. I mean, that pause. And it was like, what, really? I mean, who does this? And they did it from 1961 to 1966. Funds were raised, and the authorities in the Diocese of London, the City of London, have at it. And a national effort. President Kennedy was the first chairman of the project when he was killed. President Johnson came on board. Presidents Truman and Eisenhower came out of retirement to lend their notion. Winston Churchill himself, at 88 years old, endorsed the project. And the idea of establishing a Churchill memorial, even before Churchill died, it was called the Memorial Project, was born. And this Wren Church was dismantled in London and rebuilt in Fulton as a tribute. And the museum is in the Undercroft. And it's a little bit like the war rooms in London. We're in a bunker below, and we have galleries and exhibitions. And right now we're installing the Iron Curtain speech exhibition, which is great.
I remember, I don't know if it was the first time I was there, but certainly as an adult, the first time I was there. And you showed me around, and it's just the most remarkable space, both the museum and the bunker. And then the way you step up into the church. I mean, it's sort of breathtaking. It's a remarkable place. And I've always thought so. And one of the things I really love that you have there in your collection out front is the pieces of the Berlin Wall itself, which is really a full circle moment from the speech that you were discussing. And I just think that's so remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only remarkable, it's remarkable in it happened so quickly. After the fall of the wall in November of 1989, Edwina Sands, Winston Churchill's granddaughter, saw it on television like many of us and said, I want to put a sculpture incorporating the wall on the campus where Grandpapa gave his Iron Curtain speech. And a year later, to the day, November 9th, 1990, former President Reagan was here dedicating that sculpture. The man who said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, was in Fulton, Missouri, in the heartland of the United States, dedicating a monument to the end of the Cold War. Extraordinary. And it's a great reminder for the public and particular students here at Westminster College. I mean, if you look at the western side, it's graffiti clad. But what Edwina did as a sculptor, she punctuated the wall. You can actually walk through it. The sculpture is called Breakthrough. And on the eastern side, you see this stark, cold, dark gray concrete. And there's nothing more touching or moving to see Western freedom of expression, the graffiti, and the other side is this dark, cold, where if you were standing on the eastern side of the wall 50 years ago, you could be shot. That it sums it up, the divide between what Churchill was talking about in the Iron Curtain speech. And that Iron Curtain was a metaphor when Churchill talked about it in 1946, but it came to being and ultimately came down. And you're right, it's a powerful exclamation point or full circle moment, as you put it, Warren.
Well, now we've come full circle. That's a great place to end the episode. Tim Riley, Director and Chief Curator of America's National Churchill Museum, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
We're very grateful for everything you do.
Well, thank you, and I'm grateful for this great podcast.
So, thank you for joining us on this special bonus episode. We'll be back with regular episodes very shortly. Please do like, share, leave a review, and KBO.
Renewed thanks to Tim Riley of America's National Churchill Museum.
Next time, we'll be exploring Churchill's adventures as a young man on the northwest frontier of India.
Join us for that here on Churchill, the finest half hour. And in the meantime, KBO.